Hello, my friends. And once again, the most important development in the world is not happening in boardrooms, parliaments, or think tanks, but on the battlefields of Ukraine, where the Russian army continues its steady, methodical advance. That ought to be an obvious statement of fact. Yet if you look at the Western media ecosystem, you would hardly know it. Instead of acknowledging that Russia is winning this war on the ground, they obsess over spectacles, meetings, summits, photo ops, the latest stage-managed tour by Vladimir Zelensky, the reality on the front lines and the reality portrayed to Western publics have now diverged so dramatically that they may as well be taking place on different planets. The latest distraction for Western elites was the meeting in London attended by Zelensky, where Donald Trump's proposal to move forward with substantive peace negotiations with Russia was effectively brushed aside by European leaders and the Ukrainian side, rather than treating this as a serious opportunity to end a disastrous war. They are losing. They did what they always do: stall, posture, and double down. After London, Zelensky reportedly moved on to Brussels, where he appears not to have stayed long, and then on to Rome for an audience with the Pope and further meetings with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who has been one of his stalwart supporters. Even as Ukraine's battlefield position deteriorates, Zelensky continues his European roadshow, endlessly traveling, endlessly asking for money, weapons, and guarantees that simply cannot alter the strategic balance. The Pope's decision to meet Zelensky and the posture he has adopted in doing so carries its own disturbing implications. The Pope is not only a spiritual leader, he is also the head of state of the Vatican City and presides over a government with a foreign ministry and even its own intelligence capability. That dual role imposes responsibilities that go far beyond photo opportunities and rhetorical gestures. As head of the largest Christian church in the world, he should be acutely sensitive to the fact that Zelensky presides over a regime that has actively targeted the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, seizing churches, promoting a rival politicized structure, and using legal and even coercive means against clergy and faithful who remain loyal to the canonical church. For a pope to appear publicly aligned with such a government at this moment and under these circumstances is, in my opinion, profoundly unwise. It undermines his moral authority and will, I believe, come to embarrass him deeply over time. The British royal family has chosen a similarly reckless course. During Zelensky's previous trip to the United Kingdom a couple of weeks ago, he was received by the king at Windsor Castle, the king going out of his way to signal public support for Zelensky and for Ukraine. The Queen has also spoken to a business forum, again offering verbal backing to Kiev and repeating the tired, inaccurate parallels between the conflict in Ukraine and the Second World War parallels that play well to certain British myths, but are in substance profoundly wrong. The House of Windsor is aligning itself openly with a failing project built on fantasy and Russophobia. Their embarrassment, when reality can no longer be denied, is likely to be far greater than the Pope's. Since we have begun with London, let's continue there. It was entirely predictable that Zelensky would arrive, be feted, and that European leaders would line up behind him to proclaim Trump's framework unacceptable. They did exactly what Bloomberg previously forecast and what I discussed in an earlier program. They urged Zelensky to stand firm on territory, to refuse to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Donbass. Zelensky, of course, eagerly agreed. He has now publicly stated that he is not prepared to withdraw any Ukrainian forces from any position along the contact line. In parallel, he insists that Ukrainians are asking what happens after peace and how Ukraine will be protected from any future Russian attack. That is code for what he is really angling for: formal U.S. security guarantees, effectively a backdoor path into NATO. This is fully in line with what European elites have been pushing since the Anchorage meeting between Putin and Trump. Security guarantees for Ukraine that in practice are designed to place Ukraine under the umbrella of NATO while pretending not to do so. As I explained previously, even the language used by Western leaders reveals their true intent. Keir Starmer, a trained lawyer who understands the power of words, now speaks not about a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, but about a just and lasting ceasefire. That is a crucial distinction. A ceasefire is temporary by definition. It does not resolve the conflict. It freezes it. This is what they want. A frozen conflict with Ukrainian forces still holding positions in Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, including on the east bank of the Dnieper, while Russian control over liberated regions is left unrecognized. Under such a scheme, Ukraine would bide its time, rearm under NATO tutelage, and eventually attempt to retake these territories, forcing Russia into an unequal, humiliating peace with reparations, tribunals, and the rest of the Western wish list. Zelensky has spoken of a counter-proposal to the U.S., plan a 20-point document that supposedly replaces the earlier 28-point draft associated with Trump's team of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and the 19-point compromise Europeans tried to force onto the Americans. This new 20-point text, we are told, has stripped out the contentious provisions of the U.S. proposal. No text has been made public, but one hardly needs to see it to understand what has been removed. Explicit prohibitions on Ukraine joining NATO, requirements for neutrality and non-alignment, any commitment to withdraw Ukrainian forces from Donbass, and any serious caps on the size of Ukraine's military. The original American draft allowed for a Ukrainian force of 600,000. Europeans pushed that up to 800,000. A ludicrous figure. My assumption is that even those limits have now been deleted, leaving a plan whose sole purpose is to freeze the lines while preserving Ukraine as an armed Western outpost against Russia. In other words, we are back to the Kellogg plan, a conflict freeze, an attempt to resurrect the coalition of the willing around Ukraine, and renewed talk, open or veiled, of deploying European troops to Western Ukraine. Macron, in particular, has been playing with fire. He has boasted about Ukraine still having cards to play, spoken favorably about handing Kiev the frozen Russian assets, and swung wildly between acknowledging basic principles of international law and discarding them whenever they inconvenience his war narrative. A French general, the chief of staff of the army, even told local officials that France could soon find itself at war with Russia, a nuclear superpower, and that the French people must be prepared for sacrifices of their children. Unsurprisingly, this went down extremely badly. But Macron himself appears unfazed. He continues with belligerent rhetoric that is deeply unpopular in France, yet doggedly pursues it anyway. While Macron escalates rhetorically, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, escalates ideologically. Her hostility to Russia is so extreme, so absolutist, that it has made her practically persona non grata outside the Western bubble. Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, who himself comes from a neocon background, reportedly no longer wants to meet her. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi wants nothing to do with her. She is unwelcome in India. Across the broader global south, she is viewed as a fanatic who does not seek peace and in fact has publicly entertained the idea of breaking Russia into component parts. Yet this is the person the EU entrusts with its foreign policy face to the world. Even within Europe, Kallas has become a liability. When she addressed the European Parliament, a body that is itself highly Russophobic, her language was so extreme that even some MEPs were uncomfortable. They disliked her flippant dismissal of possible legal cases stemming from any theft of Russian assets via Euroclear or other mechanisms. Owen Matthews, a British journalist who remains strongly pro-Ukraine yet is increasingly critical of Western policy, has aptly called Kallas the gift to Putin that keeps on giving, because her extremism constantly strengthens Russia's diplomatic position and alienates the global south from the EU. The rational response of European leaders, Macron, Meloni, and others, would be to show her the door. Instead, they cling to her, invite her to every meeting, let her participate in all major decisions, and allow her to run a department now under investigation for corruption. This tells you everything you need to know about the intellectual and moral rot at the top of the European system. From this same Brussels circus comes Ursula von der Leyen's latest concoction, an extraordinary plan to create a 140 billion loan for Ukraine, nominally secured against frozen Russian assets, with each EU member state taking on a share of the liability. Her circulating document reportedly assigns specific guarantee amounts to each country, Germany on the hook for 50 billion, smaller states such as Hungary for 2 billion, and so on. On what basis does Ursula presume the authority to dictate the level of financial risk that sovereign states must assume? Have Hungary and Slovakia agreed to this? Of course not. The entire scheme clearly rests on the idea of using EU emergency powers to override objections and vetoes and to permanently block any return of Russian funds, even if sanctions are lifted in future. At that point, we are far beyond sanctions and well into outright theft. Using emergency powers to block repayment of money that belongs to Russia is already a gross violation of international law. Using those same powers to impose large-scale financial liabilities on member states that have never consented to them is something else again. It is so blatantly illegal under the EU treaties that even the European Court of Justice, normally eager to rubber stamp whatever the Commission wants, might struggle to justify it. If they do wave it through, they will have created a precedent whereby the Commission can impose direct financial obligations on member states, extracting money in a way that is only one step removed from direct taxation. In effect, this would transform the Commission from an EU institution into an unelected European government that answers primarily to itself. Donald Trump, understandably, has reacted strongly. On Truth Social, he reposted a New York Post article titled, "You impotent Europeans can only fume as Trump rightly sidelines them from Ukraine deal." The thrust is clear. Trump has watched this London-Brussels theater, listened to Macron, Starmer, and the rest, and concluded that the Europeans must be cut out of any real Ukraine settlement. That view is entirely logical. Recall that prior to the Moscow meeting between Putin and the Trump team of Witkoff and Kushner, there had already been a gathering in Geneva involving Americans, Europeans, and Ukrainians. Europeans came away boasting that they had whittled down Trump's 28-point proposal to a 19-point version more to their taste. But the moment the Americans sat down with Putin in Moscow, it became obvious that Washington did not treat this 19-point draft seriously at all. They continued to discuss and negotiate on the basis of the original 28 points. That alone tells us that Trump is not going to take the Europeans' new 20-point counterproposal seriously either. Yet I doubt he can fully implement his own 28-point framework. The Russians, for their part, have been clear and consistent. They appreciate that the 28 points move closer to their positions, and they are willing to treat it as a working basis for discussion, but large parts of it remain unacceptable, and it is not an agreed text. Putin, Ushakov, and Lavrov have all said as much. From Moscow's perspective, the document is a starting point, not a settlement. The bigger obstacle is not Russia, it is Washington. Trump might want to end the Ukraine war. He might want a long-term strategic understanding with Russia. He might be willing to brush aside both Kyiv and the Europeans to negotiate directly with Moscow, just as he did in Anchorage. But he does not control the American political class, which remains firmly aligned with Zelensky and the Atlanticist agenda. Congress has just voted to allocate $800 million from the U.S. defense budget to Ukraine over 2 years. By itself, this sum is not enormous compared to what has already been spent, but symbolically it is crucial. It is Congress saying, we disagree with Trump. We are still backing Ukraine. The Senate retains a large neocon majority. The House also has a substantial neocon bloc. The State Department, the intelligence agencies, the NSC staff all remain committed to the same failing strategy. Trump has never clearly or simply explained to the American people why the United States must stop overcommitting to Ukraine and accept reality. Perhaps he cannot, because he does not fully understand his own policy. But even if he did, the structural problem would remain. In American foreign policy, it is the permanent bureaucracy and the political class in Washington that carry the real weight. Presidents come and go, the agenda continues. Trump was elected in 2016 and again in 2024, largely on a promise, explicit or implicit, to break that continuity. Yet he still lacks the institutional strength to do so. In truth, no single president could, which brings us to the heart of the matter. There will be no serious negotiated peace because the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the dominant factions in Washington do not want one. John Mearsheimer has been absolutely correct. The outcome will be decided on the battlefield. Russia has been very clear. Putin recently said, in effect, we have read the 28 points. It is a reasonably good document. We can work with it. We disagree with large parts, but we are ready to discuss. We prefer a peaceful resolution. We are civilized people, and our partners in China, India, Brazil, and others want us to seek one. But if we must achieve our objectives through war, we are prepared to do that as well. And in some ways, a military victory would be more permanent, more stable, more clear-cut. Moscow is perfectly willing to keep the diplomatic door open for Trump or anyone else. But they have no illusions. The West's political class will not allow a meaningful compromise, and so Russia prepares to win by force of arms. That same clarity extends to the frozen assets issue. European elites seem convinced that Russia fears the prospect of outright asset seizure. In reality, Moscow long ago wrote off this money. Since the freeze, Russia's financial position has actually improved, and its resilience grown. What the Russians do see, however, is an enormous legal and geopolitical opportunity. Under the bilateral investment treaty between Belgium and Russia, Moscow can appoint an international arbitration tribunal whose ruling will be binding on Belgium. All they need to do is present the EU's own word statements from Euroclear, Commission officials, Financial Times articles quoting crazy ideas and exhausting legal tricks to demonstrate that Brussels is openly contemplating an illegal expropriation. They can make an ironclad case that will be watched closely by every major investor in the world. Even if there is no immediate stampede of capital out of Europe, the longer-term effect will be devastating. Sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf, large Chinese institutions, and others will gradually move money out of European custodians and into alternative depositories, Russia's own, China's, or other BRICS-linked structures. That shift is already underway. One of the key themes in the recent Putin-Modi discussions in India was precisely the strengthening of BRICS financial architecture as a safer, more multipolar alternative to the Western system. If the EU goes through with this theft of Russian assets, it will accelerate that transition dramatically. In a very real sense, Russia would welcome such a move because it would expose the West's lawlessness and hasten the erosion of its financial hegemony. Meanwhile, on the ground in Ukraine, the Russian military continues to reshape the map. Ukrainian sources such as Deep State and the Mapping Project have finally admitted that Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd are either encircled or close to it, and that Russia controls the southern part of the original Pokrovsk-Mirnograd cauldron. They talk about Ukrainian units withdrawing to more advantageous positions further north. That is fiction. These positions were taken by Russia some 3 weeks ago. The reality now is that Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd pocket are confined to a shrinking patch of territory around Mirnograd in the north, with Pokrovsk firmly under Russian control. Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, who commands Russia's forces in this special military operation, has inspected the sector personally. The Defense Ministry reports that after the liberation of Pokrovsk by units of the Second Army, the main objective of the Center Battle Group is the elimination of the Ukrainian formations encircled in Mirnograd. Gerasimov met commanders of the 2nd and 51st Armies at a forward command post, discussed the situation, and distributed state awards for valor and courage. He stressed that the siege of Pokrovsk was a major stage in the liberation of Donbass and praised the initiative and tactical ingenuity of Russian units that employed methods unknown to the enemy. Russian troops are now clearing residential areas, assisting civilians, and have already liberated surrounding settlements such as Rivne and Natovka on the eastern side. Southern Mirnograd, over 30% of the town is under complete Russian control, and the 5th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 51st Army is tasked with destroying the surrounded Ukrainian units there. The pattern is similar in other sectors. In Seversk, video footage shows Russian soldiers in the city center, and even Ukrainian commentators now concede that the situation is very bad. My own assessment is that Russia controls at least 80% of Seversk, everything east of the Bakhmutka River. Ukrainian troops cling to a small pocket on the western bank, but they are effectively surrounded. Russia already holds positions to their rear villages like Dronivka, Platonovka, and Yampol, which means there is a de facto cauldron. There is no need for Russian forces to cross the river. They can tighten the noose from the west. Expect the Ukrainian garrison to attempt a chaotic flight southwest toward Alexandrivka, across waterlogged, muddy fields, terrain that in Donbass is even worse than in the English countryside after heavy rain. Many will not make it. Those who do will be in no shape to continue fighting. In Kharkov region, Russia continues to advance as well, closing roadways and destroying critical infrastructure such as dams to deny the enemy maneuver options. We hear yet again about supposed Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kupiansk and elsewhere, just as we heard earlier, fairy tales of successful counterattacks in Krinky, Toretsk, and a dozen other locales. I have repeatedly made clear how skeptical I am of these narratives. The Russian Defense Ministry states that the West Group of Forces continues to destroy enemy units surrounded on the left bank of the Oskol River. That does not sound like a Russian position in crisis. It sounds like an encircled Ukrainian force being steadily reduced. Vitaly Ganchev, the Russian official administering Kupiansk, confirms this. He says Kyiv is still sending reinforcements into the area, even though they know the city and the wider agglomeration are lost. Russian troops control all the main routes. This directly contradicts the viral Western spin that Ukraine has retaken significant ground. Yes, there have been Ukrainian attacks. No, they have not changed the strategic reality. What they have done is drive up Ukrainian casualties in a futile attempt to create good news for Zelensky to bring to meetings in London and Brussels. It is a grim, cynical pattern that has defined Kyiv's conduct throughout this war, sacrificing men by the thousands for the sake of PR and leverage that never materializes. Step back from the tactical details, and the picture is brutally simple. Europe's leaders remain obsessed with Russia, obsessed with this war, unable or unwilling to negotiate themselves out of a losing position. They cling to fantasies of humiliating Moscow, seizing Russian assets, forcing reparations, and turning Ukraine into a NATO forward operating base on Russia's border. They elevate fanatics like Kaja Kallas, excuse open lawbreaking by their own institutions, and drag their economies and societies towards the cliff edge, all while Russia adapts, consolidates, and advances both militarily and financially in growing partnership with the non-Western world. The Americans, as their latest national security strategy document hints, are increasingly baffled by their European allies' self-destructive stubbornness, yet cannot or will not fundamentally change course. The Chinese, Indians, and wider global South watch in disbelief as the West immolates its credibility and financial reliability over a war it cannot win. Moscow, for its part, has the patience and the power to let them continue. On the battlefield, Russia is grinding down the Ukrainian army. In the courts and in the markets, Russia is happy to let European elites incriminate themselves and accelerate the shift of global capital toward the BRICS world. For all the noise about summits and peace plans, that is the real story of this war now. A West that cannot admit defeat. A Kyiv regime that burns its own soldiers to maintain an illusion. And a Russia that methodically secures its objectives, prepared to negotiate where possible, but fully ready and perhaps even inclined to allow the battlefield and the global financial system to deliver a decisive verdict.